I haven't been watching the news a great deal directly recently, in part because I'm so tired of the whole Brexit charade, and that tends to dominate British headlines these days. Important as it is, I'm tired of it. So I missed a big piece of news the other day that is Robert Mugabe has died at the age of 95. Now, Mugabe is certainly one of Africa's best known post colonial leaders, although I use that term very lightly because the sort of leadership that he showed was much more, well, it was the definition of a tyrant. Now, I kind of want to divide this into two parts. First, a critique of those who defend Mugabe, and secondly, a broad look at a general look at his record. Um, Predictably, there are people online, a lot of them would be Pan-Africanists, but there's others as well who are going out of their way to gush praise on this man, saying that he was a great figure of the liberation struggle for Zimbabweans, Rhodesia as it then was, against the British Empire, and they hold him up as one of the great anti-colonialist figures. But there is a fundamental problem in this argument, and Pan Africanists need to answer this really. If their issue is about liberation for Black African people, if their issue is about um, people determining their own destinies and so on, how can they ignore the fact that tyrants like Mugabe, and there are others, but tyrants like Mugabe repeatedly disrespect election results, or rather rig elections, utterly crush opposition, and suppress Black African people, suppress white African people as well. But the irony is that Mugabe, most of his victims were Black Africans. So it seems contradictory and hypocritical to me to say that you admire Mugabe because he stood up for the black man, and yet this was a man who murdered thousands of black men and women and children. Now, in the early days, he may have been moderate. He may have been another revolutionary figure in the same sort of breath as a Kenneth Conda or Julius Nyerere or even Nelson Mandela. But as history showed, Mugabe was no Mandela. Mandela sought reconciliation and to unite his country. All Mugabe done was continued to stoke up vitriol and division, and he presided over a situation whereby Zimbabwe, which had once been the breadbasket of Africa, so named because it was relatively prosperous compared to other African states, became a country on the brink of starvation, where the price of bread was unbelievably high, where basic amenities were not available, pretty much like Venezuela today. And that should be a lesson for those regressive leftists who defend left wing or anti colonialist dictators. But I don't think they really care. All they care about is, oh, well, Mugabe was anti Europe, so he must be right. Not talk about the EU, obviously. He was anti European countries, and particularly Britain. This is a man who once compared himself to Hitler in boastful terms. Now, looking at the sort of people defending him, they're really not surprising. Pan Africanists have a track record of downplaying and excusing and even defending the tyranny of African dictators. They've done the same with other tyrants. I mean, Mugabe's by no means the only example. Hastings Banda, Idi Amin, the list goes on and on and on. More recently, Omar al Bashir. I do see some things gradually changing for the better. For example, the former Chadian dictator Hissène Habré was brought to trial in Africa by Africans. Now, that hopefully will start to set a precedent where Africans start taking responsibility. That is, Pan Africanism starts taking responsibility for its autocrats. So maybe some things are improving for the better, and there are fewer people living in dictatorship today than they were 30 years ago. So some things are improving. But what hasn't changed is this ignorance and sickening mentality that some people have to defend such men. Mugabe, like I say, may have started off moderate. He may well have deserved his accolade as a freedom fighter. But what happened? He became an autocrat, a tyrant, determined to grip on the power. In fact, that was the very basis for the Gukurahundi killings, also known as the Matabeleland killings, during the Rhodesian Bush War. Mugabe wanted absolute control in Zimbabwe over the popular Joshua and Como, so he conducted a brutal, some would say genocidal campaign in that region. And the estimates of dead is anything from 3,800 to 30,000 people. So this was a tyrant with a lot of innocent blood on his hands. In more recent years, of course, is the brutality of the opposition, figures like Morgan Shangarai, um, and the fact that rather than trying to bring his country forward, he he treated himself basically like an emperor. You know, having a lavish birthday for his 90th whilst his people were on the brink of starvation. And I would make this simple point to Mugabe apologists. If he was so great and so popular, why is it the Zimbabwean people pushed him from power in 2017? Now, you could argue that Meningagwa is not much better, but the fact is the Zimbabwean people had had enough of Mugabe and swept him from power. So I've no doubt editorials across Africa will be praising Mugabe because I think there's still a lot of dishonesty in terms of dictators because it's deemed to be more important to be seen as anti colonialist and to bash the old British and French empires than it is to recognize Mugabe was an African, Mugabe was in power, and ultimately this was his responsibility. And I think that the vast bulk of his tenure in office was one of tyranny. And that's how he should be remembered. That is far more overriding than those early days, as important as they may have been. That is what defines Mugabe's legacy. So those apologists, and I've seen them try to put a spin on it and say, oh, well, the liberal and Western establishments will try to make Mugabe out to be a bad guy. I even saw one sickening, I don't know if it was a tweet or something like that, by one Joshua Jackson. I don't know who he is, but he basically said, rest in peace, big man, big man. There was nothing big about Mugabe other than the fear that he caused. Um, I have to say, I always find it sickening when I see people defending and excusing dictators. My issue is not so much about criticizing the old British Empire. Okay, do that. But just be consistent. If you're really about human rights and liberty, and this is what I find so hypocritical about Pan-Africanists. They claim to be all about the human rights of Africans, and yet whenever it turns on them, whenever the criticism is leveled against an African leader for brutalizing his own people, then they go out of the way to defend him. That is a disgrace, and I think it's cowardly actually, in the sense that it is dishonest, and in the sense that they are defending a tyrant when the victims of that tyrant don't have a voice. I mean, we're the ghosts of Matabeleland. I wonder what their views on his passing would be. So Mugabe should be remembered as a ruthless tyrant who brought his country to the brink of ruin. That was his legacy. And as far as I'm concerned, shame on those who defend the likes of Mugabe. I know what the agenda is. I know what the narrative is. That it's easier to blame everything on Britain and France, but the fact is, Mugabe had an iron grip on power for 30 years, over 30 years, and he destroyed his country. That is his legacy.